Okay, so thank you all for coming. We're happy to have you. Before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that all of our lectures are filmed on our YouTube channel. So if there's any lectures that you ever miss, or if you'd like to revisit any of these lectures, please go on our YouTube channel. We've filmed them all. Thank you, Gene 8, for being the person that puts them and films them on our YouTube channel. We appreciate it. So my name is Mackenzie Vappel. I'm the educator here at the Los Alamos Historical Society, and I am here to introduce our distinguished guest this evening. We have Lanel Senior Historian Alan Carr, and yes, you've got that's very impressive. We have a librarian at Lanel's National Security and Research Center, Laura McGuinness. We have Lanel archaeologist and historian Ellen McGehee here. And award-winning graphic artist Paul Ziomek. So they are here to talk to you all about the Nobel Laureates of Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. So without further ado, I will hand the mic off to you, Alan. Thank you very much for being here.
Hey, thank you, Mackenzie, and thank all of you for being here as well. So I think we're going to have a fun conversation with all of you tonight as we jump into this. So it says here that I should give brief history of the book itself. Is that right? I should ask first. So everybody hold up your copy of the book.
What book?
Yeah. We'll get to that. We'll get to that, I promise. Where's Sherry?
She's waving it.
She's got a bootleg copy. So, you know, maybe we'll have an auction. See how much Oppenheimer House we can fix with that book. There'll be more. But anyway, you know, the story of the book, as I remember it anyway, goes back to when I started working at the laboratory back in 2003. And back then, there was a pretty elaborate web page that was under construction pertaining to the history of the laboratory. And one of those pages pertained to the Nobel laureates who were here during World War II. And, you know, just coming to the laboratory, I thought that was pretty remarkable that you have, and by the way, in the book that you will eventually be able to get, 18 biographies of Nobel laureates in it. So it's pretty expansive. Really, it's incredible when you think about the history and what was going on and the people who were here during World War II. But that was actually kind of a controversial page because of the Nobel laureates, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, although they all did important work at the laboratory during World War II, and we talk about that in the book, only one of them did their Nobel-winning prize on lab time, and that was Fred Reines. And so we didn't want to cast them as like, you know, 18 Nobel Prizes worth of work done at Los Alamos. They were doing some pretty important things, as I think everybody in this room knows. But we wanted to, you know, a lot of discussion happened about how we should present that. And eventually, like a lot of historical things at the laboratory, it just kind of went away, like a lot of my projects. And so anyway, I never could really get this idea. Roger Mead's probably the one who built that into the webpage early on, many years ago. But I thought, you know, that we should do something with that because that speaks to the pedigree of the institution. And so the book idea, you know, I had an idea for putting a book together with biographies. And for many, many years, we almost had no staff in our shop. Until a few years ago when we built the laboratory's National Security Research Center. And I think that the laboratory came to recognize what an incredible treasure trove of real-world data we had in the various collections around the laboratory. They were pulled together, many of them, and a staff hired I think we have something like 60 people that are affiliated with our part of the laboratory now. Archivists, librarians, digitizers, historians, consultants, you know, get to bring back folks like I mentioned, Ellen and Roger, to help us out to make these projects a reality. And so, you know, that's where kind of the book idea comes from. And so I think you're going to love the book. You're going to get a sample of it tonight from some slides of Paul's work. And I know that many of you are here to hear from Paul, since he's the design guy and we need to tell historical sea stories. You'll hear from Paul, I promise. And I want to invite Paul to jump in at any time into the conversation as well. He's done some incredible work, and he's also doing another book for us that's going to be coming out, so you may see him again next summer, we hope. That's our plan there. But this book, 18 Nobel laureates, it's a big kind of coffee table-sized book. Beautifully illustrated. Every page is illustrated. You will see scans of documents and other materials, photographs in this book. And what we wanted to do before we open this up, Ellen's going to get the first question here in just a second. We wanted people to really feel like they got to know the Nobel laureate. And so with our staff, we assigned biographies to several people. Laura's an author, Ellen's an author. I wrote one of the biographies, and so did several of our others. And this is my fault because I thought about it too late. I forgot to include the acknowledgments page so that you could see all of our authors and all the people, the peer reviewers who helped us put this together, because it is an incredible list of talented people at the laboratory. So it's the work of many people in this book. And I guess now what you're all wondering is, well, where can I get mine? We had hoped to do this, our panel discussion several months ago, actually, I believe when we were first talking about it. I know this is going to shock some of you, so you're sitting down already. So legal stuff has intervened. The books do exist. There are a few bootleg copies that are out there, but the book is forthcoming. Okay, so I don't have an ETA for you. I know that you're interested and we appreciate that, but just know that the book is forthcoming. It physically exists on pallets somewhere, and we hope that you will enjoy reading it as much as we enjoyed putting it together for you. It was really a lot of fun. One of my favorite projects that I've ever been able to do. And I think you'll see why as you get to meet some of my colleagues tonight. So did I get it all?
Yeah.
Did I get it right according to legal?
I'm not a lawyer.
We'll hear about it later if you didn't.
I think I got it right. I'm pretty confident that I
right.
got it right. And so I'm sure I'll find out tomorrow if I didn't. But I know that you'd like to learn more about the Nobel laureates, and that's really what the talk about is tonight. It's less about the book, although we want you to know about the book, of course, but it's more about these great stories. And Paul's artwork for this book, which really pulls the whole thing together. So Ellen, I get to pick on you first.
All right.
And I've talked about the book and kind of how many biographies and things, but when you open up the book and you start reading one of these biographies, I mean, what are people going to read about? What are they going to find out about each Nobel laureate?
Well, I wanted to back up just a little bit, kind of follow up one of your points about sort of the origins of the book. And one of them, because I kind of read over some of the front matter and to refresh my memory. And what struck me was that the goal was not just to list all of the scientific accomplishments of all of these very brilliant people, but also sort of let the reader understand who they were more as people. And so kind of there were a lot of anecdotes in the different written sections. And also, I think one of the goals was to make it more accessible to the general audience. So hopefully that's one of the things that we did. We kind of aimed at, there's certainly going to be technical information about each Nobel laureate's scientific contributions, right? But there's also, a lot of the sections start with just biographical information, where they're born, where they went to school. We go on to, Alan talked about the one Nobel laureate who actually was on the lab's payroll at the time, right? The research was done. But some of the Nobel laureates who were here during the Manhattan Project, they had already received their Nobel Prize, just a few. And then other scientists were acknowledged for their contributions after the war. So where that Nobel Prize discussion is in each chapter might vary a little bit depending on where it was in their biographical sort of career timeline. Then I think one of the contributions, again, of the book is that we also looked very carefully at each of the Nobel laureates to find out, well, what were they doing at Los Alamos during the war? And we have such a diverse population of Nobel laureates. That's, you know, for example, the one I wrote on, he was 21 when he was here during the war. Other people were well-established scientists at the time, right? So I think that's, for each chapter, it might be a little bit of a different approach to the biography and the contributions that they made at Los Alamos during the war, right? In the book, one of the things I liked about each of the sections, and I'll look at Paul here, is at the end of each section on the Nobel laureates, there's sort of an at-a-glance graphic, and in there it sort of summarizes when they got their Nobel Prize, their life dates, and the contributions specifically that they made to Los Alamos during the war. So it's sort of an at-a-glance at the end of each chapter. What else was in there? I did like, and oh yes, nope, go back one. Can you go back? Go ahead. This is a really interesting part because since the book is arranged in alphabetical order, right, it's not necessarily in the order that these people received their Nobel Prize. But there's a graphic, which should be behind me, there's a timeline, and it lists all of the Nobel laureates in the sort of the timeline of when they received their awards. And also, there's a nice little graphic that shows you, did they get it in physics or chemistry, or did they get the Nobel Peace Prize? Now, I can't read it from here, but the majority of the Nobel laureates that were at Los Alamos were definitely received their prize in physics, but there was at least one Nobel laureate in chemistry and one who received the Peace Prize, which I think is really kind of interesting. So I like this graphic. It kind of orients the reader, especially since all these the biographies are really in alphabetical order. The other part of the book that I liked was at the very end of the book, there's quotes that each of the authors of the sections could choose some quotes to propose in this section here. And then again, nicely illustrated. I like the treatment all the way through. It's very consistent, but I think it gets to that accessible to the reader.
Yeah, you know, actually, can I do an add-on question?
Sure.
Because I have one for Paul, if you can wait, because I've got a good question for Laura coming up, as you're going to see. But is one thing we really wanted to do that we hope we accomplished is make a book that can be enjoyed and appreciated by, senior theoretical physicists at the laboratory, but also somebody who maybe is in junior high or high school working on a research project, something that's accessible. Now that is a huge breadth when you're talking about people that you're trying to reach, but I think that we did it, and I also think that, as you can probably tell from the artwork, the tone of the book, and we talked about the tone of the different books, that we're working on. Paul, can you tell us about the design and maybe kind of how it plays into all those readers that we're hoping to share this with?
Yeah, we talked about the book being a bridge to a broader audience. A lot of folks who are familiar with the Manhattan Project and the scientists, the who's who. I call them the Justice League of scientists during the Manhattan Project. But in the general public, they know Oppenheimer, and that's about it. There's not as much. And we wanted to reach a broad audience, but also have some depth of knowledge. And so we decided to take what I like to call a mid-20th century, right, because we're in the 40s here, aesthetics with a 21st century presentation, right? So you can see with the vibrant colors, and we really wanted this to feel alive, and the illustrations specifically, I think I could talk more about those later, but as you can see, each one of the laureates has been illustrated not only to address some of the inconsistent photography available for the different laureates, but also to create a sense of prestige. On the Nobel Prize itself features a profile, an illustrated profile that has a sense of timelessness. When you look at photography, it can definitely tell the story of when it was taken, which is good, and we do want to talk about the time, but we do want these to appeal to, like you said, all ages. A very approachable book that if you want to go in and deep dive on Hans Bethe and other folks, or more about the Manhattan Project, this could be a bridge to more, and there's more than just Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
That's right, and we do, I know we have a question coming up about research in a few
But
minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, you can't hold back, okay, go for it right
No.
now.
I just wanted to reinforce what Paul's saying. There's another section, and I was looking through the book, well, not the book, but a PDF, because there is no book. And I noticed what I thought was really helpful too is that, we all talk about Nobel laureates, Nobel Prize, but there's even a section that really introduces what is the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And it goes into like what and who and when and why, and it lists all the 6 categories. So there will be a quiz at the end of this talk. You will need to know what the 6 Nobel laureates, no, I'm just kidding. But it goes through and really gives a very deep background on the history of the prize itself, which, because you have to assume that your reader may not even have that. But I learned a few facts from that, so I thought it was really great.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, forgiven. You don't have to apologize. That was great. No, I mean that's right. It's a lot of fun, and of course, these are real people that we're talking about. I think a lot of people, when they do think about the Nobel Prize, might think of a statue of something or somebody or some inaccessible piece of science or something like that. We wanted to get young people excited about this, and I think one way to do that is great stories. And there are great stories behind all of the people that we've covered, which brings us to Laura. Laura wrote about, again, incredible stories, but maybe one of my favorites, if we're allowed to have favorites, besides our own, I wrote on Niels Bohr, is Louis Alvarez. Now, Louis, tell us a little bit about kind of his story and your story of writing about him.
Sure.
And I guess the other thing, maybe one of the big challenges in writing this type of history, how do you compress a life like, Niels Bohr or Louis Alvarez or whoever it may be into, what are these, about 3,000 words, something like that, maybe a little bit more?
Yeah, so when Alan and Ellen adopted me into this project, I was only working at the lab for a couple of months, and I think I had been living here for just a little bit longer than that. So I was very, very new to New Mexico in the lab, and I chose to write on Louis Alvarez because he was born in San Francisco in 1911, and I was born not very far away from San Francisco. And so learning about Luis Alvarez kind of gave me something to connect to, gave me a good introduction to some basic science here at the lab. I didn't come from a science background, and a nice foundation for history that I think kind of cemented my position here, made me feel a little bit more like I belonged. So I'll focus a little bit on Alvarez, but he was born in San Francisco, 1911. His father was a physician, pretty well known already in California, and his grandfather was a Spanish physician who was involved with diagnosing macular leprosy. He eventually went on to attend the University of Chicago. He got a PhD in physics. And then he worked at the UC Berkeley Radiation Laboratory under Ernest Lawrence, and he contributed to a lot of radar projects. So he was already really well known for something called ground-controlled approach. And a little fun fact about that is that an author, Arthur C. Clarke, actually wrote a novel and based a character off of him in the novel. So he was already pretty well known by 1943 when he got an offer from Oppenheimer to join the Manhattan Project. And he worked under George Stiachowski in the explosives division, where he helped develop detonators. So just before the Trinity test, Alvarez went to Oppenheimer and he was like, I want to do something that's going to take me to the Pacific. And Oppenheimer was like, all right, I got something, but you don't have a very long time to work on this. He was tasked with measuring the yield released by Fat Man and Little Boy, and so he came up with a blast gauge canister, which he actually was involved with dropping from the scientific observer planes at Hiroshima. So these gauges basically just gave accurate pressure time curves to help estimate the yield. After World War II, he returned to UC Berkeley, where he then went on to win the Nobel Prize awarded it in 1960 for his contributions in physics. His award-winning work was the bubble chamber, which just helps visualize particle tracks. I really liked this story, and a lot of my research was reading his memoir that he wrote. He mentioned that he wasn't very good at sticking to one project, that he started to kind of flip between projects and he wasn't able to finish anything. And so Ernest Lawrence made him promise that he would finish the bubble chamber. And that is what he ended up getting his Nobel Prize in. So I'm glad Ernest Lawrence kept him honest.
You know, I have actually one of my my favorite research request that I've ever gotten is related to Louis Alvarez.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anybody here knew Louis personally, but I bet some of you knew Harold Agnew personally. So it's a Harold story, so you know it'll be good. So I was in my office when I had not been at the laboratory very long, and Harold called. And I forgot if John Hopkins, who was my office mate at the time, or Roger Mead picked up the phone. But Harold called and he said, "Hey, was I at Trinity?" That's my favorite research question I've ever got. So we all had a good laugh about it. And then he explained, he said, "Well, I was reading Louis's memoir, and he said I was at Trinity, but I was already on Tinian, you know." But yeah, Louis must have been quite a boss, for sure.
Definitely.
All right.
Actually, Alan, I'd like to point out that at a glance right there, on the right-facing page at the end of each section, you'll get to see all the facts, a sort of baseball card rundown of each of the laureates.
Yeah, these are really cool because they make it easier to keep track. You get the quick summary there. Yeah. The design work is really good. In fact, I think that this letter also. See, we're going to start going off telling those stories. The letter over there on the left. Some of you may have heard that Louis, I believe, and with input from was it Phil Morrison and Robert Serber,
Sounds right.
dropped a letter with one of those canisters to a Japanese physicist colleague, telling them that more bombs were on the way, and so we were able to get a copy of that letter to put in there as well, so you can read their own words. Therefore, I think that was from the Nagasaki mission. I mean, there's a million good stories. In fact, one of you are supposed to ask me about mine.
Yes, okay, we'll do it, right?
Okay.
So, Alan.
Yes, totally unscripted.
So, Alan, which of the Nobel laureates did you write on?
I said it already, didn't I? So I kind of spoiled that. So I got to write on Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr, I mean, you know, talk about great stories. I assume that I'm supposed to follow on with like a good Niels Bohr story.
Yes.
So the problem with writing about somebody like Niels Bohr is, again, this issue of how do you capture Niels Bohr in 3,000 words, approximately. Yeah, you know, that's exactly what Brian, that's what I was thinking. I have these ideas, and it's like, what on earth was I thinking? But then, so we did it, and there's so much material. There are books that have been written on Niels Bohr, and documentaries have been made. We had documentation, and that's another thing, is that, you know, these biographies are referenced, so you will see where we got our information from. Sometimes those references are directly from the primary source documentation. For instance, when I was doing my research, I came across a set of slides, or view graphs, I guess, back then. Remember those? For the young folks in the audience, before we had this, we found his view graphs from 1944. And you'll see a scan of those. I don't think I think that is one of them somewhere. Yeah, they're Niels Bohr's view graphs from a lecture in 1944. I guess, you know, just a quick story about Bohr is his escape from Europe. You know, I didn't realize this at the time, but he stayed in Denmark a lot longer than I realized. So Denmark, I think that the battle for Denmark lasted something like, a few hours. Denmark could not put up a fight against Nazi Germany. And the Germans actually had a very, very light occupation of Denmark. And so Bohr, of course, is Jewish. And he stayed there for a couple of years. But then when the Germans decided to occupy it and change things, it happened very swiftly. And he literally escaped by moonlight on a boat to Sweden. Now, but maybe the more interesting part of the story is what happens next. How do you get from Sweden? Yeah, Greg knows up here. How do you get from Sweden to the UK? So Sweden is neutral, and my source for this story, because you can find this story in multiple places, but I chose to use J. Robert Oppenheimer as my source. Oppenheimer came back and gave a talk on Niels Bohr here in Los Alamos. I believe it was in 1964. We have the audio recording of that. And so I used Oppenheimer as my source, telling me how they put Niels Bohr in the bomb bay of a British Mosquito fighter bomber. Some of you may know about this, single person plane, 2 engines, there's not a second seat, so where do we put Niels? And of course, because it's not pressurized, he passes out during the flight, but he makes it. And I mean, these kind of things, so many stories I could talk about with Bohr, and I guess the only other thing, for now at least, we don't want to tell them everything, or they might not want to.
Okay, got it.
So we're not going to tell you everything that happens, but to me, Bohr is really an inspirational figure. When you look at his feelings, he had a dream about a world in which especially global wars would become obsolete. And I would say that because of the product of this laboratory and the Manhattan Project, that's kind of happened so far, at least. Nuclear deterrence, I think, is very much of an offspring of this work. He visualized a world that went beyond that, though, that I don't think is practical as long as there are humans in it. But he set that target, that inspirational target for mankind. I think that, at Los Alamos, he didn't do a lot of technical work. He worked on implosion. He worked on the initiator while he was here to some degree. In fact, I think that I couldn't find the patent, but he's listed as the inventor on a bomb part. I think it was an initiator's design or something like that. But, he had been thinking about post-war nuclear issues well before the war was over. And I get the sense that not a lot of the younger people who were at Los Alamos on the staff had been thinking about these nuclear issues. And he challenged them to start thinking about them. And so I guess regardless of, what you think about his ideas, whether they were practical or not, this, that, he was a deep thinker. He was committed to peace. And he saw nuclear weapons as a part of that peace. And it's just an incredible story with Niels. Now I get to throw it back to Ellen at this point. Niels had a son.
Yes,
and his name was something that I have not yet pronounced properly. And so Ellen, in her exhaustive research, can now pronounce his name properly because he is also a Nobel laureate.
He is a Nobel laureate.
Mm-hmm. So how do you say Bohr Jr.'s name?
Well, okay. Now, remember, you don't know, but I am not Danish. So,
do we have any Danes?
Danes.
In the room?
Hopefully.
So,
okay. So, this was a really important part of our research.
we wanted to get it right.
We wanted to get it right. And so first of all, I turned to the internet, which was a mistake. And, yes, it was a mistake. I don't even know where these people get their information, but anyway. Then I was going through some of the sources, and I was reading Otto Frisch's memoir, What Little I Remember. And in like a footnote, it says, this is how you pronounce his name. And so that's what I was trying to train Alan with for a while. And then I thought, I don't even know if that's right because it's kind of hard to do phonetics in a book. And I thought, what I really need to do is find someone who is recorded saying his name, but who was actually here during the Manhattan Project, because it's sort of like, what did people who were here, how did they pronounce the name? I mean, it could have been wrong too, but at least it might have been a little closer because they were with him at the time. So I thought, well, okay, I know there were some classified recordings or somewhere, or interviews somewhere, and I didn't.
Just building the suspense.
I didn't have
I
time.
love this.
I didn't have time for that. So I thought, well, there's been a lot of oral history recordings that were done. They're actually done in Los Alamos, and they're up on the Voices of Manhattan Project website. Some that were just done by random people, but they're all up there, and there's transcripts and there's recordings. So I used my new profound skill, Control F. Everybody laughs at me about that, but searching for Bohr's name within the website, and lo and behold, it appeared that Jean Bacher, in her recorded interview, talks about Niels and his son. All right, so then I was like, okay, this is the definitive way you pronounce the name. And I thought, well, just to be on the safe side, I will consult the internet one more time. And sure enough, there's this gentleman, kindly gentleman, who is doing all of the vowel pronunciations possible. So the reason, okay, so if you're looking at the slide, you can see that his name has 2 A's at the beginning. Well, in Danish, it's actually pronounced O, not A, and the G is actually silent. So on the internet, it's more like O is his name. And Jean Bacher pronounced it Oa, like Shoah, kind of. So anyway, she was actually the closest, so we're just going to call him Oa Bor.
You know what, I think that...
Now, you know, as a historian...
This is the kind of high-quality research
that goes into this. But as a historian, when you read documents, you don't always worry about really the way you're
it's
pronouncing
one-dimensional in a sense.
names, right? So it's an interesting way to kind of get into his life, his culture.
Well, we had so many, we wrote this during COVID primarily.
Yeah.
This was kind of a work-at-home project for us. And I mean, these kind of became, I don't know how you feel, but I mean, they kind of became like cast characters in my life for a while as we were putting these together. And yeah, we wouldn't have, you would overlook something like that.
Right.
Maybe for any other type of project. But
And
not
you're
this one.
writing, and you don't expect to be in a presentation in front of people having to pronounce the name. They're just going to read it and say it in their head. But the G is silent, so if you say it in your head, there's no G.
Well, so follow-up question to this, now that I can say his name properly. So he is, I will make the confession, so
Well,
that
you
you don't
go
have to
ahead and
make me
confess.
feel bad.
Okay.
Originally, I was assigned both of the Boers, and I needed help, and that's when I went to Ellen. And you have 2 Nobel laureates, when you look at their stories and you look at the source material, are kind of at extreme opposites when it comes to that material. With Niels Bohr, you're not going to lack for finding material. It's just kind of synthesizing that story out of all this. When you look at, excuse me. Now this is really actually one of my favorite things to do as a historian, is when there is a story there, and you know there's a story there, but you only have, little puzzle pieces. And what you had to do, I mean, it was kind of surprising. Here's a Nobel laureate. There just wasn't an awful lot about him. Can you talk to us more about that?
And it won't have anything to do with pronunciation. So
We got that out of the way.
Yeah, this is now my actual skill. I actually do have a skill set as a former archaeologist and as a historian. I have a skill set. First of all, it's always like helping Alan out when
Yes.
he's in a fix.
Yes,
right?
Ellen has always said,
Yes.
it takes a village for me
Yes.
to get anything done, I believe,
There you go.
as you've said.
So he says, well, okay, I'm not going to dump this on you, but I really couldn't find any information. Do you think you could help me out? Which is like, okay, challenge accepted.
Challenge accepted, yeah.
And actually, there was enough information really about his Nobel laureate, his Nobel Prize and his contributions as a scientist, because the Nobel Prize website and the American, I don't know if I get this wrong, Institute of Physics
Right.
websites, they have quite a bit of information. So that was the easy part. The difficult part was how do we find out what was he really doing during the Manhattan Project? He's 21 years old. He seems to just kind of roam around with his dad all the time. Was he a personal assistant? Was he a scientist? We didn't really
As
know.
you can see in the photograph,
Right.
there.
And so, I searched through all of the sort of the standard websites. I actually looked at a lot of the Niels Bohr biographies that were out there, and sifted through and could find these little tease out these little sections that started talking about not his sort of scientific contributions per se during the Manhattan Project, but his contribution to supporting his father. And in numerous sources, even just the published books. We're not even talking about diving into the primary sources or looking into more obscure Los Alamos resources that we had. It was, they kept saying they were inseparable. They were inseparable. And so
I can remember Oppenheimer said that, Oa was Bohr's, they were confidant, so he was more than just an assistant. He was really kind of enabling Niels Bohr to be able to navigate through the war years, because they weren't here all the time, right, during the war. They made the rounds. They were going back and forth and back and forth. They had very fond memories of Los Alamos and being up in the mountains. So as I was going through this, I did find, through persistent research, using the archivist's help, I found that there was an oral history, I think it was, let me see, it was Robert Bacher's oral history, actually, and it was conducted for the book Critical Assembly. I love that book as a historian, and I think it's a really wonderful, very technical history of the Manhattan Project, but it was research done, this oral history was actually conducted by Lillian Hoddeson, and in there, they're discussing the initiator problem, and that there was this committee that had to be formed because I think Fermi was skeptical about the initiator design for Fat Man, and there was a note that Oppenheimer was losing weight constantly because he was so worried about it, because if the initiator didn't work, then Fat Man wouldn't work, right? So they did assign the problem to Niels Bohr, and they went and used him as sort of he wasn't really local, he wasn't prejudiced or biased on any camp, right? The pro this design, the pro that design. So they laid out all of the data and gave it to Niels Bohr, and Oa and Niels spent 2 days. I picture them in my mind's eye walking back and forth. They love to walk and talk. They did this for 2 days, and then Niels Bohr came back and says, I think it'll work. Basically, I like your idea. So there are a lot of the references that we were looking at that I found that did talk about how Oa wasn't just his personal secretary or just a family member who was there with him traveling, a traveling companion, but he was very useful in sort of Niels Bohr bouncing off science. They had scientific discussions all the time. And in fact, there were a couple of the memoirs. Those are the other sources that I really like to use. There's some Historical Society publications, a shout out to the Historical Society, that memoir accounts and other publications written by people, sort of reminiscing about their wartime here. And they would constantly call out not only how the Boers worked together as this inseparable pair, but also how absent-mindedly they walked around town. One of my favorite sources that actually I didn't find, but Alex Welshing had found, was a security guard's lament about how he had to walk around town following the Boers, and they would be just walking as if they were in the woods, but they were actually not paying attention to stop signs or traffic, because they were so just immersed in what they were talking about. And so I love that picture because, and I don't know the date on that one. I can't remember. It's later, I think. But it just shows so much about their relationship. And again, it goes back to that goal of the book, which is bring out the humanity, I think, of these people. So.
And actually, our next question kind of ties in with that. And this is for Paul, you weren't included, but I'm including you in this question now. So I won't make you go first, so you can think about it. But we've shared a lot of stories, and I mean, these stories are, so much fun. They're so much fun to discover, to rediscover. Favorite story? Laura, what do you think? Favorite story about...
Favorite?
Huh? And it doesn't necessarily, it could be, I know that Ellen, for instance, I already know her answer kind of, but she's going to be talking about somebody besides her Nobel laureate on that she wrote about. But what do you think favorite stories that you encountered? And of course, Paul, like I said, you got to look at all the book together and piece it together. What do you think?
Alvarez was a tricky one for favorite stories because...
A lot to choose from?
He was really interesting even just outside of physics. In the 50s, he worked with the CIA to make sure that UFOs were not a security threat.
which overlaps with some of your other interesting
We don't
research.
talk about that.
Oh yeah, I can't say that. That's right.
Then, after the Kennedy assassination, he helped mathematically prove that Kennedy had been shot from the back of the head. He helped search Egyptian pyramids for hidden rooms. And then later in life with his son, they postulated a hypothesis for the extinction of dinosaurs. So he's a cool one. But my favorite story is actually the day before the Trinity test when Alvarez was leaving his home up here in Los Alamos. And he was saying goodbye to his wife, Geraldine, and I have the quote here. He said in his memoir, "I told my wife what most Los Alamos wives were told, that if she happened to be up at 5 o'clock the next morning and happened to look south, she might see something interesting." Like I mentioned earlier, I had just moved here. The reason why I moved here was because my now husband accepted a job as a scientist. I was struggling to adjust. And in his memoir, he talked a lot about his wife sort of struggling to adjust to life on the Mesa. And she was a housewife at the time, but there were a lot of women who were employed here at the lab. And you're lucky because Ellen is the world's expert on Manhattan Project women.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big title there. I would shrink it down to I know something about the women who worked here. In fact, we're still finding names in databases that I completely missed when I was doing my master's thesis.
Yeah.
So so it's really great.
And you're going to tell us about one.
Well, I am.
Right?
Maybe.
Perfect segue.
I think there is a slide up there. Wow, there's a woman. Yes. So of the 18 Nobel laureates who had some connection with Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, Marie Guppert-Mayer was the only woman. But the fact that there is a woman in this book is great because her inclusion, her story in the book also highlights, I think, sort of tangentially, the contributions of all the other women who were working on the Manhattan Project, not just here in Los Alamos, but across the country, and all the women who were supporting World War II, for example. But Marie Guppert-Mayer was really an interesting story, and I didn't write that particular section, but I had helped the writer because I had basically profiled Maria in my master's thesis. So it was just kind of, I was trying to be a mentor, I guess, to the writing process. But her story is really fascinating because even though she only visited Los Alamos briefly, but she was already working on a Manhattan project at Columbia University. She was working on the substitute alloy materials, the SAM project, which was, they were looking at ways to separate uranium isotopes. But she did get rolled in to a super secret project working for Edward Teller. And her research actually was more contributing to the development of the hydrogen bomb. But she was a visiting scientist, a consultant here at Los Alamos, and did come to Los Alamos at Edward Teller's urging. And I have to say something nice about Edward Teller.
I guess we can't be too nice in this room.
Okay, all right. No, seriously.
But it's true.
I have to say something really nice about Edward Teller because he recognized early on her brilliance as a scientist and encouraged her even after the war. She was at Chicago working with him, continued to be supported by him. And why is that important? And it's because Marie Guppert-Mayer was profoundly impacted by what's called the anti-nepotism rules, which are enforced in many of the major universities in the country, and essentially kind of negated her career. She couldn't achieve tenure. She's not a household name in any way, shape, or form. She's a Nobel laureate, and most people don't know that she's the second woman in the world who got the Nobel Prize in physics, right after Marie Curie. Right? So she's not a household name. And how the anti-nepotism rules worked is if your spouse was in academia at a university,
and you're a woman, you could not be paid in a paid position in a tenure track position. You had to be a volunteer or work at some, junior college or women's college or something like that. And so for most of her career, while she was here in the United States, she got her education in Germany, and she was a German by birth, but she married an American and came to the United States, and then was working in Columbia. But for most of her career, she was pretty much discriminated against just by virtue of the fact that she married a fellow physicist, right? So, and I think this is really important, and there's an illustration that you can see up there that I also have up here, and it's really, I had a history professor at UNM, Dr. Timothy Moy, who pointed this out to me, because it's still, it was something that he had found. He was California, also Berkeley graduate, and he had heard this story, but he had actually seen this newspaper article. And we just have the picture up there, right? We don't actually have the article.
Yeah, no,
I
just,
can't
yeah,
read
it's
upside
just
down.
the same photo.
So in 1963, she shares the Nobel Prize with, what's his name? Jensen? And it's really on a sort of clarifying nuclear shell theory, right? And there was another scientist who also was involved in research, so there were 3 people sharing the prize. But so she wins the Nobel Prize, and so the next day, obviously there's going to be a notice in the newspaper. So her local newspaper, at this time, she finally was after years and years and years, she was a tenured professor in San Diego. And so her local newspaper issues the following article, and it says, San Diego mother wins Nobel Physics Prize. Now, the reason I bring this up is that she not only do we talk about her background and her prize-winning research and her contributions to the war and everything in the book, but it just sort of drives home the fact that throughout her entire career, she was basically faced with these assumptions of what the role of women were. During the roles of women during the 1940s, when she was active, 50s, and even into the 60s. You would never have seen this type of a newspaper headline if she had been a man. So.
No, can I add a quick story? Because I can't help myself.
Go for it.
But that was because of Maria's work. When we were identifying, what constitutes a Los Alamos Nobel laureate, if you will, for this book. Maria was a consultant, and an important one. She didn't spend a lot of time here, as you mentioned before, but she was formally affiliated with the laboratory. For those of you who saw the Oppenheimer movie, I guess it's worked its way into every lecture now, but you remember that part where Edward mentions the hydrogen bomb and everybody laughs at him in the room? Anybody remember that? I guess it was a forgettable movie. A couple of us, right? That's not what happened. The H-bomb was actually a pretty significant effort during World War II. It just wasn't one of the main lines of research. And so Oppenheimer, I think the documentation shows, did everything he could to nurture that program without compromising the main lines of research. One of the tactics for that was enabling Edward to go out and try and find people to help him elsewhere. And Maria was one of those folks. At the same time that he was getting Maria involved in opacity studies at Columbia, he also heavily recruited an African-American scientist named Ernest Wilkins, who would not have been given the rights that he deserved at Oak Ridge, where he was about to be sent to from the University of Chicago. So a couple of good Edward stories there. Yeah. That doesn't happen very much here. But anyway, I thought that, Edward obviously saw talent, which was your point, and wanted to bring that to bear on the early H-bomb, and a lot of significant work. That's a story for a different day, but probably made a lot of significant progress on the H-bomb during the war. It's, this brings us to Paul now, I think. What do you think, Paul? And you're going to get, so I know that, for those of you in the Paul Ziomek fan club with me, now is what you've all been waiting for, because actually Paul's going to get 2 questions in a row here, I think. What about, What about it? You designed the whole book. You got to know all these stories. You got to design design the stories. What, did you have a favorite?
Well, you know, they were all like characters like in this big story, and so I really can't. You guys kind of took some of the really, really good ones, but I would say, you know, I identified with certain aspects, like Enrico Fermi. I grew up in Chicago. Of course, he came from, you know, developing the Chicago Pile and understanding the University of Chicago, having the relationship here. You know, just identifying, I lived in Albuquerque, and Richard Feynman had traveled in Albuquerque and had his wife was there, and Joseph Rotblat, the only Peace Prize winner, was Polish, and I'm Polish. So, you know, just little things that you kind of identify. These become a little more than just names in a history book. You know?
Well, you see, and that's the thing. I think that's what we were all going for, was to make these, because everybody can find these connections to this story.
Yeah.
Now,
And Maria Goeppert Mayer, I would say, also was a big inspiration, because her appearance in other books drove some of the initial design concepts. Because she had appeared in many books alongside Einstein and being like major figures in science and STEM, and looking at those types of collections where she appeared several times. So, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. You know, and actually, I said I'd give Paul 2 questions in a row. I do before, because these are tied together. I want to go back to Laura and ask about the images, because you know, some of these images came from our repository. A lot of them didn't. Where did these come from? Because of course then we'll go to Paul and talk about design. We'll just about be done, be getting close. But I mean, what was it like scavenging all the images? There must, I don't know, how many were in the book, Paul?
Jeez. I mean, every page has got at least 2 or 3 images, so about 600 images, roughly.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
So you're getting your money's worth, not that we're selling books, again. Forthcoming. Well, what do you think, Laura?
Yeah, so I am a librarian who does a bit of writing on the side. And again, we were writing this during COVID, so I was working from home, and I relied really heavily on our senior archivist and our photo archivist at the NSRC. I'd tell them, hey, I need some photos on Alvarez, and they'd go in, they'd do the research that needed to be done, and then they would digitize the photos and the drawings. Paul, can we see the blast gauge canister drawing?
Blast gauge back.
With the green outline, do we have that one?
It's coming.
Okay. So
That's a great example.
it is, yeah. I mentioned the blast gauge canister and Alvarez's involvement in that, and that is a drawing of a very similar one that he would have worked with. And we initially would have, gotten that drawing, and it's pretty big, it's about this big, and it's on vellum. And we would digitize that using our equipment, and at the sort of end of compiling all of these images, we needed to digitize a lot of them at a higher resolution. So we had to go back into the archives, locate each of them, redigitize them, and then some of them, like this one in particular, were ours. But other ones, especially, there's a chapter in Hans Bethe that I helped do research on, and a lot of the photos of him are later on in his life. We didn't have any photos at Los Alamos of him later on in life. So those were photos that people had found, like on the Nobel Laureate website or at other academic institutions. And so the librarians and archivists had to reach out to those institutions and confirm that they belong to them and figure out how to credit them, just make sure that everyone was getting their due credit. And then one of my favorite parts of this was one of the ways that you can start to kind of do the investigative work to figure out if a photo or drawing or image belongs to you, to use these little loupes, these little magnifying glasses, and you can study the film to see if there's any negative numbers on it. And you can look at the positives too, and you can trace it back, and then you can find your negative in the archive. That's how you know it's yours. But Paul, like with this blast gauge canister, really made it come to life, I think, with the green outlines. This is one of my favorites.
There's a research project behind some of these individual photographs.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So a lot of work was done. I mean, we brought together a lot of things from all over the place.
Really?
So, and I think that kind of gets to our question for Paul, and then I think we'll have our final question after that, it looks like. There's a lot of pages in this book. There's a lot of design work, there's a lot of stories. You know, from your standpoint as an artist, I mean, we've talked about kind of, you know, some of the research issues that we encountered. What are some of the challenges that you encountered in designing the book?
Well, Laura hit upon it right, because, you know, not every laureate had the same type of quality portraits and not the same amount of visual artifacts. So in order to make a book that felt balanced and evenly distributed with an aesthetic that was consistent, we had to rely upon a couple of devices, a couple of graphic devices. Of course, we also wanted these things to be as appealing and as relevant to today. Of course, this was developed well before the Oppenheimer movie was even filmed. So that sort of Oppie-mania, Barbenheimer stuff wasn't a factor.
We were doing this before it was cool.
Exactly.
That's,
So we got pink in there somewhere, and that had nothing to do with Barbenheimer, I guarantee. Actually, maybe we set the trend. I don't know. But so one of the big decisions to tackle the problem of inconsistent imagery, because we wanted to feature most of the images to really look at the collections of the National Security Research Center and whatever Los Alamos had owned. But there were some people who you just like Oa. You couldn't find very many portraits of him that we could own. There's a few instances, I think you probably count on one hand how many outside photos were sourced that we had to credit with the AIP or other organizations, WikiCommons. Of course, there's some General Alfred Nobel imagery in there. We actually have in our collection the Raines is it's a reproduction.
Frederick Rhinus's,
of Rhinus's.
I believe the Historical Society owns the Gold Nobel Prize. Is that correct? And we have the one that you show in your office, just in case somebody steals it. It's not made out of gold, so we have the backup. Yeah. That's right, and made a scan of that.
So we did all that, and you know, one of my colleagues, a very talented gentleman by the name of Michael Nudeman, he actually, he's a fine artist and printmaker by trade, but he also is a very dynamic designer. He's the deputy group leader of my group, and he had come to the lab recently, and he had done these series of portraits. How many of y'all are familiar with vector art or vector graphics? Yes. So I'm going to pull up one of these. So he illustrated, I'm very jealous, because I'm an illustrator as well, and I do portraiture and caricature and whatnot. But you know, his approach was very clean. It was very honest. It went for a likeness, but it didn't go for caricature per se. We wanted it to be a very reverent and transparent presentation of these people. And so, you know, that was one of the, of course, each laureate, it opens with one of their portraits. So you can see that those illustrations were a through line visually. And then, of course, we created the system of denoting whether it was physics, chemistry, or peace, and the eclectic colorization of some of the photos just for balance. You know, we wanted to make this as widely appealing to folks as possible, and if it were page after page of scanned letters that were mostly sepia-toned, that could get a bit redundant, or it may have not do the stories justice. As a graphic designer, we just want to hook you to get you to read. That's all. And so the last thing I'll show in terms of the visuals is, and if there's any graphic designers out there, there's my style sheet there. You can see that we sort of took an approach with color palette, with typography that was reminiscent of mid-century. You know, we're thinking 1940s, a little bit into the 50s, although, you know, mostly in that mid-century, because this was not exclusively awards won during the Manhattan Project. Some during and mostly after, and some before, actually. Nels was
Bohr was before.
Yeah.
Most of them won their prizes after. That surprises a lot of people in telling them in the past, but most of them won prizes after. A few of them had before, and I believe that Isidore Rabi won his in 1944 during the project. So,
yeah. We also have one more feature in there. Of course, there's captions for all of those. You can see credits for what was not part of our collection and what was, as well as the pull quotes. And the pull quotes were used extensively, again, with the personality. And pull quotes, if you're familiar with magazine design, and some books use them, but these were sort of used almost like magazine layouts, as if you were flipping. It's a non-linear read. You can really just flip through, and something might grab you in those pull quotes, and hopefully that was designed to sort of bring you in. Of course, those have the rugged typewriter font to sort of, again, call back to the mid-century, but also, again, with the 21st century colorization. And, scrapbook. That was also the thing, is we sort of wanted it to be as if you were browsing our collection. I don't know if we talked about McGehee cards. Is anyone familiar with the McGehee card, what that is? Okay, yes, so everyone that came through to work here in Los Alamos had to visit Dorothy McGehee, who was essentially your entry into the lab, and a lot of these laureates, we dug up their McGehee cards, which were the 3x5 cards. I believe I have, there we go. There's one from Maria, and arrived with teller, visitor, and a couple of them would even say their salary.
Yes.
What was like a whopping $40 or something.
I think the real high salaries were $300 a month.
Yeah, I know.
It's about the best you could hope for.
So we scattered them, we sort of juxtaposed things. Sometimes we trimmed out photos to sort of emphasize the silhouette. Here we see the Ottawee Bridge that can still be seen on the side of the road there, to sort of give it not too flippant. We didn't want it to seem like a high school yearbook in a sentimental way, but I don't know, just tactile, touch and feel. So that's what informed a lot of the aesthetics.
That's great.
And Paul's working, again, we're working on another project, similar in nature, but a little bit larger scale, actually, and it'll have a completely different tone. And I've seen previews of it. And so that's something exciting for next time. Now, I think we have one more question. Is that right?
Shall we ask together? So, Alan, there's something we really haven't talked about yet today.
Okay, let's get it out there.
All right. So, why didn't Oppenheimer, who was so brilliant and so revered by everyone who worked here during the Manhattan Project, and who's been featured in this film, why didn't he ever receive a Nobel Prize?
Well, I don't know. But I have a guess. And some of you may have a guess, and my panelists may have a guess too. Now, I will say this. Our colleague, Bryce Steeves, who is also the director of the National Security Research Center, she wrote a piece on this very topic in the book. And so you should probably go with Bry and her explanation if it contradicts mine. But we had talked with this, Bry and myself. We also asked some of the folks who helped us. Some of our technical reviewers. For instance, I don't think we mentioned Tony Redondo, who wrote the introduction to this book for us. Grateful to Tony. We asked around because, I don't think there's an official account of Oppenheimer was nominated, I believe, 3 times for the Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure with this group and their phones out there, they'll be checking right now. So we'll let me know if I got that wrong. I think there's a couple of reasons that he did not win a Nobel Prize. When you look at Oppenheimer, when it came to scientific publications, he was not a tremendously prolific scientist. He does not have hundreds of technical pieces that he wrote, but he did write a couple that have, I think, enduring significance to us that you might use, and probably, I believe, were, in making the case that he should have been, hence the nominations. For instance, I think probably his best-known technical work, besides the bomb stuff, pertains to what today we would call black holes. Now, at the time, they would not have used that term. But he and one of his graduate students they postulated the existence of black holes. And I think that work was published. The publication date was September 1st, 1939. Does anybody know that date for another reason? Of course, the day that Germany invaded Poland. Now, again, check me on that. But he did some incredible work, and but he didn't do a ton of it. So part of it's good if you can get a lot of lead in the air to win a Nobel Prize. And a lot of the scientists that we've talked about were very prolific when it came to publications and experiments. Now that's one thing. Now the other thing is I use the word postulate, not prove. And I think this ties in with the Nobel Prize as well. If you're going to win a Nobel Prize in a field like physics, they're not going to give you a prize for some cool idea, are they? You're going to need to demonstrate that idea. And so I think that a lot of experimentalists, now we've seen theoreticians, but I think it's probably easier to win a prize as an experimentalist because your experiment proves something revolutionary as opposed to proposing something that may or may not be the case. And so I think that's something that handicapped Oppenheimer is as well. Again, Nobel Prize is going to generally award something that's been demonstrated. The other thing is, going back to those nominations, the award is not given posthumously. Mm-hmm. And I think that with some of Oppenheimer's early theoretical work, as it was demonstrated in years later, after he passed, that if he had lived longer, it's possible that he might have won one. And again, this is kind of what-if history, and I know that some of you will have opinions on that as well, but I think those are kind of the three main reasons that he did not win a prize. There may be others as well, and other thoughts on it.
And I did have a question, because even after we devised this evil last question for you and
Yeah,
make
thanks.
you talk, I went on the internet again and tried to see if I could find any more information about the nomination. So he was nominated, I have my cheat sheet, in 1946, in 1951, and in 1967, but I couldn't find anything about specifically, it just said for physics, but usually you're not just nominated for a category, you are nominated for a very specific thing that
Yes.
you've worked on. And there must be somewhere out there, some more information about that. I just didn't find it. But to me, it would be kind of fascinating to find out, what in 1946 did someone nominate him for, and what in 67 did they nominate him for?
Right.
So just did it change through time, or was it some of his earlier research,
Yeah,
or were they nominating him because of his contributions
I mean, I think a lot
to
of
the
it
development of the atomic
No, I don't think there's
weapons?
any. In fact, I've heard another thing that I've heard from people that I believe is quantifiably wrong with this book is that work on the Manhattan Project somehow blacklisted you and hurt your ability to win a Nobel Prize. Remember, as we talked about before, most of the folks in our book, they won their Nobel Prizes long after the Manhattan Project. And you saw the timeline that goes, we had Nobel laureates from during the war, the 50s, 60s, so on all the way up. Was Val Fitch the most recent? Or maybe not. But anyway, I should know since we put the book together. It's on the timeline.
It's on the timeline.
But I think that it almost seemed to have helped because there was a very high percentage of Nobel laureates who did participate in the Manhattan Project. So I think maybe the opposite. Did I meander off into something else, or did I actually answer the question?
You answered the question.
Kind of. I do think a lot of what he was nominated for must surely have gone back to his early astrophysics work, though. And maybe it came back up again as more things were physically demonstrated through experiments. It kind of pops up later again in 1967. But that will be it for Oppenheimer because he's passed away. Again, it's not awarded posthumously. And I don't know, maybe that's it for our prepared remarks as well. So we'll stop there. I'm going to hand it back over to our friend Mackenzie. And thank you. And we'll take a few easier questions. So.
Not getting the physics prize. What about the Peace Prize? I can't think of anybody more responsible for peace than he is.
Yeah, can I take that one?
Go.
Or can I start that one?
can
And then
start
I'll end? So
What was the question?
Okay, so I'll repeat it. We had a little bit of a technical problem there, but so what about the Peace Prize? Do you think Oppenheimer might have been a good candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize? And I think, so my thought on that, we do have one of our prize winners did win it in peace, and that's Joseph Rotblat. And Rotblat he's got an interesting story in and of itself, which you can read about in the forthcoming book. I think that's the proper term there. Oppenheimer was a controversial character. I think that Los Alamos is probably the least controversial place for J. Robert Oppenheimer, where we have multiple statues of him, and we celebrate his career, and I think rightfully so in many ways. But he is a controversial figure, and I think that in many places of the world, he's seen as just the opposite of that, even to this day. Rather than, because I think you can make the case when we think about nuclear deterrence, when we consider that it's 2024 and there's not been a World War III yet. Hopefully that will hold, again, forever. I think you could make a case for Nobel, for Oppenheimer, but I think that there would be probably a very forceful case to the opposite of that would come from many quarters as well. You have introduced weapons of mass destruction. Maybe there's not been a war yet, but there could be tomorrow, and when it happens, it's going to be catastrophic. Different things like this. And so I think that, when you're going for any Nobel Prize, you generally want to try and achieve some level of unanimity in it. And I think Oppenheimer would probably be a tough sell if that were the goal.
Because I was reading that sort of Nobel Prize background part, and it goes into how are people actually nominated, or how do they actually receive the prize? Because there's thousands of nominations that they sift through, and then there's committees and organizations that review that, and then there has to be a majority vote to agree. And there are a few rules, like you can't have any more than 3 people sharing a prize, right? Yep. And that you'll see that often in the lists. Why are they're kind of split up? But again, back to what you're saying, you would have to have a group of people who are absolutely in agreement. And he is such a complex, complicated person in his story. I mean, you can read it about it. You can see it in the movie. He's because, and you bring up a good point. He's sort of seen today as possibly somebody who was very not supportive of the hydrogen bomb in the end, of course. But initially he was, right? So he's conflicted. People think, he was really a man of peace. But yet he was also on the target committee, and really his job during the war was to develop these weapons that would end the war. Yeah. So he didn't back away from it at the end. Right. I mean, he didn't say, okay, I've made this weapon, but I'm not responsible for using it. That's not really what happened. He was involved in a lot of the decision making for the actual deployment of the weapon. So he is a very kind of conflicted, complicated person, and maybe that's why.
Yeah. I think when I got to talk with our friend Sig Hecker, a couple of months ago, it's good to be back with the Historical Society, of course. I mentioned something that I would recommend everybody here watch on YouTube, and that's Oppenheimer's 1965, I believe it was CBS interview. Instead of conjecturing on what he would think about this topic or that topic, listen to him himself, or yourself, and see what he has to say about it, and then make up your own mind. I would say, in my mind at least, he was very hopeful, and this kind of gets back to this idea of a more peaceful world. Mm-hmm. I think that he recognized the significant challenges that the world faced at that time, which we still face today as well. But I think that he preferred to at least give equal time to the hope that was made possible through new technology, new institutions that had been able to flourish, and different patterns of human behavior. Again, there was becoming a more and more well-established pattern, and this gets right back to the question, I think, of nations solving their problems with each other in the form of these massive global wars, which claim tens of millions of lives. That's a pattern that we've not seen repeated since then. And I think that that's, going back to this idea of peace, it may be a bit paradoxical, but I do think that these inventions have maintained a peace that otherwise would not have been possible. We'll never know for sure, but I think that he would be glad that we've not had a world war yet, but he might be a bit surprised that we've not come up with another idea. We'll see what the future holds. Thank you for that.
I've been plowing, and I mean plowing, through another biography of Oppenheimer by Ray Monk, who may well still be at the Santa Fe Institute. And he says, I haven't gotten there yet, he says that he's going to be dealing with a lot of the physics, which of course the movie didn't cover very much.
Right.
So maybe some of the questions you have about what the nominations were about, maybe in that book, I don't know, but I just thought I'd mention it.
Oh yeah, do one of you want to start on that? Just speaking to the science that we present in the book, basically. You want me to start? I can start. It seems pretty quiet up here. Now, something that the four of us have in common is that, you know, we're not technical people by training. At least that's not our primary training, you know. People used to ask me all the time, you know, I'd be introduced as the historian of the lab, and they'd say, "Oh, well, what did you study?" I studied history. You know, I guess the assumption is like I'm some chemist who couldn't make the cut, and so you know they maybe. I think that was the assumption. In the case of this book, I think that was actually an advantage, because the thing is we considered these very complex ideas from the past. The first person or the first people who had to understand these concepts were us. And fortunately for us, we are at an institution where the total head count is now 18,000 at the laboratory. 18,000 is our official total head count now of scientists at all stages of their career from all over the world. And some of them are better technical translators than others. But we had people from across the spectrum who were willing to help us out. And I was grateful for that. I mentioned Tony Redondo earlier, Dave Clark. I mean, I hate to even mention names because I'm going to leave them out. But we all worked with people, and at least in my experience, if I was talking about Bohr's science, whether it was the early structure, his idea for the atom and quantum physics, and complementarity and how it fits into understanding the quantum world, I needed help. And, you know, I would go back and they would explain a concept to me and I'd say, nope, didn't get it, try again. And you will see, you know, our book is kind of the end product of that. Because the thing, you know, at least for me as a historian of science rather than an actual scientist, I don't think that science, you know, science is not something that people can't understand. It's just a different language than most people are taught. And sometimes conveying that language to people can be very difficult. We've got some remarkable technical translators at the laboratory, though, and so I'm very grateful to them for helping me out. Seth Blackwell, who's one of our physical chemists, we spent hours on the phone talking about Bohr's work, for instance, and it was a great experience for me, a learning experience for me, and I hope, you know, again, I think the final product will make these things accessible to high schoolers and hopefully get them interested, coupled with these stories from history in these fields. That's our hope, and maybe it's overly ambitious for our little book, but that was very much at the heart of what I was hoping to accomplish. I think our whole team was.
Yeah. And I was thinking that, you know, even though, I mean, it could certainly be a resource at the school level too. You know, I just think it's not just for sort of a general adult audience. I think that it could be, you know, used for, you know, using, you know, in any kind of high school class on science in general.
Yes.
Great background book, you know, and a lot of really good information. Now, I didn't really try that hard to understand the science of what I was writing, because I am a historian of the social and cultural history of science. So I actually steer well away from anything scientific. I don't know about you, Laura, but
Yeah, I actually have a memory of struggling with a science concept that I was writing about, and Alan stood with me for an hour over the drawing. Poor Alan going over and over how something worked and making me repeat it to him over and over again. But it was very helpful for writing. And I want to add on to what Ellen said. This book, I think, will also be helpful for new staff, right? And it is kind of condensed a little bit. And so non-technical staff who are coming on will be able to read this and get a foundation for the history and the science, which I think is really valuable.
Good point.
I think we have one question back here also.
This might be the last one. I drank too much water.
I was afraid
See,
to
none of
drink-
my colleagues have
I was afraid
partaken
to
yet.
drink any because I was going to spill it on myself.
I just wanted to mention, if all of you would like to see this mysterious book, we have a copy at
There's
the
it
Hans Beta
exists.
House. We have a copy at the Hans Beta House. Come on by any day except Sunday and look through it. It's a wonderful book. And if you're wondering where we got it from the bookstore at Bandolier.
Well, there it is. Chris, thank you for mentioning that.
It's not for sale. It was a sample copy
Yes.
that they got and gave to me to bring up to the Hans Beta
Oh,
House.
man. Well, I hope a lot more to follow.
But it's there right this minute.
We're getting our stuff.
Hi, as historians, you have access to all sorts of interesting stuff and real stuff. How do you react, and do you even go to these Hollywood movies about these scientists?
That's a good question.
Excellent question.
What do you think? Who's going to kick us off?
Oh,
Ellen,
I'll
or
start out.
Laura,
with,
okay.
Barbie?
Sorry, yeah. Ellen and I actually went to Barbie together before any one of us saw Oppenheimer, so go ahead.
Right, I actually saw Barbie more times than I saw Oppenheimer. And I saw Oppenheimer twice. all 8 hours or whatever it was. Not back to back, not back to back. No, in the first time I was asked to watch the movie, it was actually because right immediately after the movie, for the second time I was going to watch it, we were going to have like a panel discussion with a bunch of historians, and I wanted to watch it by myself first, actually, so that I would be prepared for the questions that would come and the response that historians would have to the movie. So I didn't want to go to a public presentation without having actually sort of, cold, right? I needed to have a little time to think about what I was going to say about the movie. And it's not just this movie, though, right? There's a lot of movies that have dealt with the history of the Manhattan Project. Fat Man and Little Boy, for example. I don't know if you remember that one. And so I won't harp on Oppenheimer, but I will say that it's Hollywood. And Fat Man and Little Boy, for example, so I was looking at somebody who had a park shirt on. Oh, Albert. No, yes. Manhattan Project National Historical Park. We have to put a plug in for that. But one of the buildings that's was basically preserved, saved by the laboratory, is the Slotin, we call it the Slotin building. It's really the site of the Slotin accident. And it's at Power Rideau Site TA18. And in the movie Fat Man and Little Boy, for dramatic effect, they move the accident into the war timeline, and it actually took place in 1946. Technically still part of the Manhattan Project, but not actually during the war. And so, even though it's great, there's long-suffering, was it Laura Dern and who's Cusack? Yeah, right, great drama, but it really doesn't have a lot to do. It's loosely based on Los Alamos history. So, of course, elements of Oppenheimer, and of course, Alan gets this question all the time, like, what was right about the movie, what was wrong about the movie, what did you like about the movie?
I've seen 2 movies in the theater in the past decade. And so I'm not a movie buff, okay? And so I'm not the best person to ask. But I will say in general, for me at least, as a historian who goes to see historical movies occasionally, I try to go in with a completely different mindset. A movie is designed to be entertaining and profitable. these are not concerns to historians, you know. So I'm going to see a completely different product.
You're
And,
entertaining, Alan.
Well, I try. I mean, you know, it's hard to mix fun in with weapons of mass destruction, but we try. And, you know, I'm usually successful in doing that. And there are not that many historical movies where I'd say, you know, that's pretty good, because it's a different product for a different reason, and you're trying to tell complex stories in very short amounts of time. So it's just something different. The Oppenheimer movie, I do think that, again, I'm not a movie buff, so I'm not the best person to give a review, but I think as a film, it's something that's going to be remembered. 7 Oscar nominations. It's something that's going to be with us for a long time. And I think as a film, again, not a filmmaker or anything even close, but I think it's a marvelous film. There's lots of, if you're going to learn history, don't learn it from that film. Right. There's lots of problems with the film. Technical problems, omissions, things that are just completely made up, and there are good reasons for that. Again, it's a completely different product. You know, it's like we can't there's already like 5,000 characters in the movie.
I had a hard time because they didn't look like who they were supposed to, and so I was like, okay, which one is that character? Which one is that character?
What's like Oppenheimer, or I should say Einstein, keeps popping up everywhere. He comes out from behind trees and things like that. But he's used as a device because he's accessible to audiences, and if we didn't use him, we'd have to introduce like another 50 characters into the film. He's also a public figure, so you don't have to worry about his estate suing you. There's all kinds of, which is a real issue with this.
But don't you think that really one of the really neat things about the Oppenheimer movie is that now you could just, if you're interested in that history, then go find the accurate information.
Well,
right?
yeah, I mean, Ray Monk was mentioned earlier, who his biography gets more technical. Of course, there are Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, who the movie is based on.
Right.
Their treatment's a less technical one, but it gets more into his life and different things like that. Right. There's all these other things that hopefully get people interested in the science. But yeah, for me, when I said that I go in with a completely different mindset, usually I'm successful. I wasn't, because that's been too much of my daily life for 20 years now. So it was difficult sitting there. It's like, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. He wouldn't have said that. You know, things like this. Sure, I annoyed all the people in the audience around me, but that was me with that movie. A wonderful film, but yeah, read a book.
This book.
Yeah, if you can find it. That's
You know I couldn't go by without a question.
I was waiting, Greg. I was waiting.
What happened to Fred Reines's apparatus that used to be in the lobby of the old administration building?
Oh, no, this is, what did they call that? Yes, which means eye in German, I think, as I recall.
No, it was called something else. It had 2 names. Yeah, it was the hair. Okay.
Yes. So is that part of the Bradbury collection now? No? Do we know where it is?
It was in the lobby. It was in the lobby for a long time.
It was still there. No, I hope.
No, when we moved out of the admin building,
yes,
and that was when I was doing archaeology and historic buildings. We inventoried, we walked the halls, we worked with the Bradbury, we worked with the staff to bring things over or treat them like artifacts. But I'm not sure if that was still in the, so for example, the topper cloths, right? All of those were preserved. Some of the conference room, there were artifacts in that building. So, but I can't remember whether that was still there at that time. I know what you're talking about, the big round.
Yes. I'm sure the Bradbury has it.
We'll get a phone call from them.
We're gonna call Wendy.
Yeah, I know.
Greg, thanks for the question, I guess. Hopefully we'll have a good answer for that tomorrow, because we don't quite yet. But yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that. It was still at T Division when you went in, when I started at the laboratory. Hopefully it's not a lawn ornament now.
But he did do his research, though, in the tunnel, parts of the research
Yep,
from the early
the TA-41 tunnel, Savannah River.
detector work.
Yep.
And that tunnel is still there.
Still there.
Yeah, it's the secret, not secret tunnel.
There are YouTube videos if you're interested.
Featuring Ellen.
And Alan,
Yeah.
and Glenn McDuff. Not Laura,
Hey,
you were
wait,
here
you
yet.
had one already.
Well, in my opinion, this program,
We can repeat it.
the best program about Oppenheimer is the one produced in 1980 by PBS.
Is that the Sam Waterston? Yes.
I thought, first of all, Sam Waterston did a much better job as Oppenheimer, and it was technically pretty darn accurate. It was 7 one-hour segments.
There was a lot.
Highly recommended.
I've not seen that in a long
You
time.
can get the DVD now, but I've searched for YouTube and I can't find it.
It's not on there. That's too bad. I need to revisit that one.
I've never seen it.
No? No, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. It was an extensive, I mean, there was a lot of coverage of the hearing. I mean, it was really one of these complete, check. So if anybody finds where we can get a copy of this, for free, preferably. All right, well,
I think that,
is that it for tonight? I guess that's it for tonight. This is awesome to be up here with my friends. I'm sorry to my friends who I forgot to mention because I forgot to have the acknowledgments page too. That was on me.
right. And there, and we didn't mention Riz at all, or
Riz,
Brad.
who worked with our photographs,
Yeah.
And,
There's a lot
with
of
the forward,
people.
he was a manager at the lab. So many other people, and again, the book is forthcoming. It physically exists. It will be distributed, we think, before long. And I really hope that you enjoy it. I really, really hope that you do and that you'll share it with others. We don't make any money off it. Well, except our salaries, I guess. But anyway, thanks as always to the Historical Society, such a wonderful host, to Pack 8, and of course the folks who are letting us use the building here at Crossroads tonight as well. This is a lovely venue, and thanks to all of you, too.